good to see you people again. This is always fun for me. I mean, people sometimes ask what are my hobbies, and what I'm doing at the moment is a hobby. It's my occupation and my hobby. I love learning things, and this whole series, which in Israel is a 12-part program, is particularly relevant this particular moment because it's a Tisha B'Av program. It's about an event that happened 16 years ago. The final evacuation of between 8,000 and 9,000 Jewish settlers was one day after Tisha B'Av. By the way, when they did the planning, they did it by an English date, and they realized it was going to be Tisha B'Av itself, and that wasn't a good idea. So it was one day later. It's a tough program. Ari said that this is a tough program, and it really is. So, but this is the reality of Israel, a new country still trying to find its feet with very many different kind of opinions and subgroups. So just to start off a little bit in the background about the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip, you can see the map over there, I've been there a number of occasions, by the way. So as I'm talking, my mind constantly flipped back to my very first visit to Gaza, which was 1969. The army brought me in for 2 days because I'd been very interested in slum areas in Africa. So they heard about it and said, come and look at a slum area. So they brought me to the Gaza city over here. And at the end of the first day, they kind of were interested. It was not clear what was going to happen to Gaza over a long period of time. So these terrific young officers say to me, you know, what do you think we should do? You know, you just visited Gaza City. And I said 2 comments. Firstly, I would be happy not to have to come here again. And they kind of laughed and wondered why. And the second point was that we Israelis have a really big problem here. The poverty of Gaza City was something that I haven't seen, even though I know Soweto in Johannesburg, Gaza City was even more depressing than that. But let's get to the background of what the topic is. The Gaza area, which is a poorly defined area, by the way, it hasn't got clear borders at all. There's no rivers or mountains or anything else that indicated. Anyway, in 1918, it became part of the British Mandate. And in 1946, so remember this is before the creation of the State of Israel, settlers are here in Kfar Darom. It wasn't clear because this was all originally the Ottoman Empire and afterwards the British Mandate territory. So here we have Kfar Darom being established as early as 1946. When the UN partition plan was implemented, which brought about the State of Israel, the whole of this area of Gaza, as we see it here, this whole area of here, came under Egyptian rule. And from the period of February 1949 to June 1967, it was under Egyptian military rule. And the conditions were horrendous, which, by the way, explains when I saw the Gaza city in 1969, it had only been under Israel a short period of time. It was still essentially suffering from Egyptian rule. And the Egyptians had a good idea as far as they were concerned. Let the Palestinians in Gaza be miserable and they will attack Israel. And sure as anything, that happened. After the Six-Day War of 1967, the area was taken over by Israel. And as a result of the Oslo Accords formulated by the late Yitzhak Rabin and the late Shimon Peres, the first stage of the Gaza, of the peace process for the Palestinians was a program called Gaza Jericho Now. The idea was that this would be the first area that would be given over to the Palestinians. It didn't go forward. The whole thing really didn't work for a number of reasons. Then you have the Second Intifada. And by 2005, there are 21 Jewish settlements. So all these little places you see over here, 3 in the north, 1 Netzarim, Kfar Darom, and this whole area, which is called Gush Katif, all these areas bring the Jewish settlement of Gaza, an area which has, at that time, well over 1.5 million Palestinians, to 21 settlements. In a very, very poor area, money was always coming in from outside, as is the case today. And in 2005, it was 1.2 million. Today, it's estimated there are 2 million Palestinians. Ari mentioned the pictures, and what I'd very much recommend for any of you who find what I'm presenting in this particular program of interest to you, I very, very much recommend that you turn to YouTube and look at the program Gaza, the Fight for Israel. It's a 49-minute program, quite remarkable. And, you know, all the things that I can't do by not showing moving images. I'm the old school kind of guy. But if you really want to see the pictures of what happened, and I think if you listen to what I'm saying and then see this 49-minute documentary, you'll get an excellent sense of a very, very dramatic story. What's significant about this particular documentary, they look at both sides. So you see amazing and sometimes very distressing pictures of the settlers. And on the other hand, you also see it through the eyes of the army, particular senior officer. So, you know, in these kind of situations, there are always two sides of the story, contradictory narratives in some senses. So this is what I advise you to do if you want to go one step further, in addition to what I'm presenting. Now, the whole issue of Gaza has an unusual kind of initial stage, and just if we look at these things, we can see in this level it's unclear what's going to happen up to 2005. But here we see Ariel Sharon. Ariel Sharon we met last week when we were talking about the war in Lebanon in 1982, and he was a very complex person to understand. There's some good biographies about him. When one listens to his speeches, it's quite hard to know what he's really all about. Now, I mention this because it's extremely important to understand that the settlers in the Gaza Strip and those in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, very much saw him as a supporter of the settlement policy, particularly the Gush Emunim movement. But he shows sort of contradictions. And the first contradiction was as a result of the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel in 1979, and it was a kind of an extended peace treaty program. The second and third stage of the peace treaty with Egypt required that the city of Yamit and some surrounding areas be removed. And Menachem Begin, the prime minister of the time, got Ariel Sharon to move the settlers out, clearly acting against what he really believed in, because he was a pro-settler person, but tough guy, defense minister. He managed in a kind of a very violent event in Yamit when the settlers were throwing paint down on the soldiers, very tough images. That was fulfilling the peace treaty. Then there was a movement set up, a very powerful NGO movement, by the way, which the settlers in Israel have been very effective in organizing themselves. Gush Emunim and this other one, movement to stop the withdrawal from Sinai, they were presenting themselves in two realms, two ways. One was a religious messianic approach, which says, you know, this is the almighty inspired action. We are settling the land of Israel in fulfilling the religious demands. And the other, they maintained that it was very important to retain territory, that the territory that Israel got, in their terms, the liberated territory, should be kept by Israel for security reasons. Israel was a small country. After 1967, it was obviously a lot larger. He became Minister of Housing and Construction, and immediately said we have to go through a massive settlement program. And we still remember the pictures on TV where he takes out a map of the wider land of Israel, and he turns around to his assistants and he said, why aren't we building? Why aren't we setting up settlements? You know, why aren't we moving ahead? And they're trying to say, you know, there are restrictions and things like this. And he says, under no conditions. Then the change comes about. And this is what's so hard to understand, although there are a whole never-ending list of suggestions on what was really happening. Between 2001 and 2006, he's the Prime Minister. It's a period of suicide bombings, very tough period in Israel. Palestinians are being killed in Gaza. And he makes initially a very unclear statement about a Palestinian state, not quite clear. Remember, people saw him as their leader. The settlers saw him as their defined leader. And then from 2003 to 2005, and I've just taken some of the components because it's filled with action, this whole period. We begin to hear different comments that he makes, by the way, sometimes contradicting himself. Because in January 2003, in the Knesset election, he opposed evacuating Gaza settlements. And he said, the Gaza settlements are equal to Tel Aviv. Equal to Tel Aviv. That means, you know, you're not going to mess around with the Gaza settlements. Then in March, January, February, March 2003, he comes out with another comment, totally contradictory. It is not right for Israel to rule over 3.5 million Palestinians, talking about the Palestinians both in Gaza and in the West Bank. December that year, at the Herzliya conference, very, very important conference held every year, some of the main strategists of Israeli society always turn up to that conference. So it's very important for all of us to listen to very carefully. He comes out with the following comment: we would like you Palestinians to govern yourselves in your own country, a state with territorial contiguity in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank of Judea and Samaria. So what's this about? Doesn't quite explain. And then a few months later, February 2004, he starts to use language which was much clearer. And here he speaks about universal withdrawal. Now, in the world of political science, I think nothing worries leaders more than the concept of unilateral withdrawal. Because in a unilateral withdrawal, you just do what you think is good for you and don't consult the other side. And this began to worry people, regardless of whether they were on the left or right. Surely, if you're going to make any kind of decision, you're going to negotiate with the other side. But Sharon had in his head, and he hadn't explained it to anyone at that time, except for a very small group of advisors, why he really thought like that. And he's talking about withdrawing all the settlements in the Gaza Strip, 21 of them, and 3 in the northern area of the West Bank. At that time, the Knesset opposed disengagement, the withdrawal plan, by 60%. 40% were in favor. So if you're asking what the country felt like, and one assumes that the Knesset is a fairly good way of understanding what the population is actually thinking, almost 2/3 of the Knesset members say no. So this seems to be where the country is. If one looked at March 2004, one said, wherever Sharon's ideas came from, it obviously has no kind of validity. Slowly but surely, he manages to influence certain members of the Knesset. And by the end of that year, the disengagement won in the vote 46 to 45. By the way, that's 91 seats in a parliament of 120. So a lot of members were not getting involved in the vote, abstaining. The opposition only really starts, the opposition to the until then the majority vote, the kind of January 2005, what is almost above, just a little bit above 50% apparently, is the fact that there's a unity government with the Labour Party, and there's a large peace rally in Rabin Square of 150,000 people. So looking at the times, it's not quite sure exactly where the country is, but I remember my own feeling at that time, I'm saying essentially the country's against it. 150,000 peace rally is a big number, but it's not the real number to carry the population. What is perhaps most important in understanding Israel at that time was that 40% of Israeli Jews thought there was a possibility of a civil war. Now, we've had this term coming up in the past. It happened before the creation of the state with the underground militias. It happened during the German reparations issue, which I spoke about a few weeks ago. Civil war is a tough topic, and you only use it if you're serious. 40% of Israeli, and I think the Israeli polls by and large are pretty good, were frightened that we were talking about a civil war. Where were the powerful voices coming from against withdrawal? It came from the religious groups. Overwhelmingly, there were some secular groups involved, but the real ideological power came without doubt from the religious groups, very much influenced by Gush Emunim graduates at Merkaz HaRav, a very important yeshiva by the son of the great Rabbi Cook. The son, Tzvi Yehuda HaKohen Cook, was a tremendous pro-Gush Emunim person. At that time, the religious Zionists were approximately 15% of the population, but had tremendous political influence, which has been true until very recent. And then two extremely important comments made by former chief rabbis. What are we talking about? Chief rabbis in Israel have tremendous power, not power in terms of political power, but power in terms of what they say and how it's appreciated. We must remember, when a chief rabbi makes a comment, very considerable number of Israelis, without question what the chief rabbi is saying, says, this is what it is about. And the Ashkenazi former chief rabbi made the following comment, which started a whole process which led the country to increasingly be afraid of the civil war. And he supported refusing military orders. Well, what are we talking about? We're talking here about a very delicate situation. If a defined section of Israeli society goes out and tells its soldiers not to obey the orders, Israel is in absolute crisis. This is chaos, a level of chaos that we can hardly imagine. He was supported by Mordechai Eliyahu, the former Sephardi chief rabbi. And he said, in speaking about this whole idea that Jews were going to be evicted from their homes, he used an expression which resonated in a powerful way among literally thousands of people. Speaking about them, my apologies, the idea of expelling Jews from their homes, which is what the evacuation process is about, it shall not happen. This isn't a politician speaking. This is a former chief rabbi speaking. Therefore, it had the feeling that this was not in the realm of the political arena, but in the holy arena, in the role of the Almighty. And people have told me afterwards that when they listened to Eliyahu, particularly Sephardi people, and he said, it shall not happen. This is not, it's not a papal figure, that's true, but it's a figure of such status that you really believe that this is essentially what's going to happen. The language, and I've just taken a few sources over here, the language resonated very broadly. A weekly broadsheet spoke about we must control of the mechanisms, we must seize control of the mechanisms of government. This is talking about, wow, you know, we have to get there on the streets, not just as demonstrators, but taking over government. And we shall live to see the building of the temple, big stuff. Arose 7, one of the broadcasting stations, the rabbinical authority of the program of that station speaks about, getting the area of the great river, the Euphrates, to the Great Sea and River of Egypt, some of the biblical terminology. Wow, this is becoming much more factual. And the committee of rabbis, the rabbis involved in the West Bank and Gaza, they were speaking about there would be a spiritual revolution with the collapse of secular Zionism. The long and the short of what one gets from these perspectives, it's not the full picture, but at least from these perspectives, that the feeling of many of the secular leaders who called for civil disobedience, that this civil obedience would prevent the evacuation. This was going to be a moment of Israeli history when a Knesset vote, and at that time it was only by one member, very, very fragile kind of a voting system, that the civil disobedience, the getting onto the streets in a powerful way would actually prevent the evacuation of the 8,000 to 9,000 settlers in the Gaza Strip. There were other voices, not nearly as strong and somewhat conflicted in how they wanted to make a statement. However, Rabbi Tzvi Lau of the Hebron Yeshiva, very important yeshiva, originally from Eastern Europe, established itself in Hebron. Afterwards, as a result of the 1929 massacre of the Jews in Hebron, moved to Jerusalem. And he said very, very clearly, he was definitely against the refusal to obey army orders and against civil disobedience. It's important to put this into the salad bowl as well. The people who said we have to obey the government, even if we disagree with government opinion, were not nearly as vocal, but they were out there. And we find, for example, that many of the yeshiva heads in particular, they opposed disobedience or refrained from expressing their views. So they were very frightened that if they told soldiers to accept army instructions, and the soldiers themselves didn't believe in it, they would put themselves in an awkward position. They therefore left it fairly open. The issue, in a sense, becomes increasingly difficult because it was going to have to be carried out by soldiers and policemen, many of whom, as we're going to see in a moment, were themselves religious, and without doubt, many of them were listening to the voices of the various rabbinical authorities, either saying, we will disobey army orders because this is what our rabbinic authorities have told us, or we have to obey the army because that's what we are a part of. And there's an underlying unbelief among many of those people, even as the action was being carried out, the wider population, even religious soldiers and policemen, that they were convinced that their ongoing prayers would bring about a miracle to undo the entire process. I think of during our 73 years of history, we have rarely found a situation where the spiritual emphasis and feeling of a significant number of Israelis comes into such harsh conflict with the government decision of the time. The people who opposed the unilateral declaration became active in the most remarkable way that one can believe it. Firstly, they remembered the 1982 Yamit event, which I mentioned earlier, where there was a conflict between the settlers and the soldiers. And the term that came up in 1982 and exists until today, essentially, is a Jew does not expel another Jew, and also the expression, do not uproot that which has been planted. The settler opposition grew from March 2003. They were listening closely to the comments of Ariel Sharon, who then was Prime Minister. In July 2004, a most dramatic way of demonstrating, unknown in the power of what they did, was that 130,000 people held hands from the Western Wall in Jerusalem all the way down to northern Gaza, a distance of 56 miles. Unbelievable. You know, I remember it so clearly. You know, it's not all that long ago. You see these people standing line after line, and this is July, like Israel is now at the moment. July is a terribly hot month in Israel. There they were standing, holding hands for a distance of 56 miles. Sharon was aware of what was happening, and he came out with a very powerful statement, of which here I just produce a short bit. And on the one hand, he says, you know, I understand what you're feeling about. And he says, you know, you who have built homes there, planted trees and grew flowers, and who gave birth to sons and daughters, who have not known any other home. So, and he says, I feel your pain and rage and despair. So, you know, I could understand from the perspective of many of the settlers, they were listening to a prime minister who himself was having doubts. And I think this also, the kind of feeling, this particular speech, which resonated through Israeli society, was very much, well, we can push Sharon. Sharon is the kind of almost by himself, so it seemed, incorrectly, but it seemed to be that he was almost by himself. We can stop him doing what he wants. Main roads were blocked in the country. And in July 2005, a few months before the final action, there was a large, tens of thousands of people were on a 3-day peaceful march from Netivot, a development town, to Kfar Maimon. So once again, you're having tens of thousands of people. Once again, I want to emphasize, in July, hot months in Israel, getting involved. Approximately 20,000 police and soldiers were called up. Then yet another form of taking the streets. And this is the remarkable component of this particular event of Israeli history. Not only was the chain, not only was it peaceful marches, not only was it blocking main roads, but a very large demonstration, 100,000 more than the peace demonstration in the same place, the Rabin Square, demanding a halt to evacuation. August, 1 month before the actual action is taken. And here we can see the beginning, Kol haaretz lo'olam shelanu, all the land for all time is ours. And we're beginning to see the very important picture over here, the orange clothing. The orange clothing, the sign of opposition. Sorry, I've got a block here. I don't know why, I've had it once before. Sorry, it catches and then it goes. Sorry, my apologies. The evacuation, as I mentioned earlier, was carried out 1 day after Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, in the years that I've been in Israel, takes on a increasingly important role within Israeli society, because through Jewish history, the ongoing events that have been carried out on the Tisha B'Av against the Jews, the two temples, all the way up to the Warsaw Ghetto period, and again, they saw this as a Tisha B'Av moment. What are we saying? If Tisha B'Av has always been done by the other, here it was being done by the Israeli Jewish government. So this is really adding yet another component to the whole feeling. If we try and get a broader picture of what's happening, we have to remember that we were talking about 750,000 of religious Zionists by one definition or the other, and 250,000 residents in the various areas of Israel, of the post-67 borders. Only 20,000 participated. Does that mean that not all settlers were interested in objecting? Probably doesn't. 20,000 is a very, very significant number, particularly when we add that to the various other protest events which had carried on. Among the people who were most active, in many cases, were non-residents, people who came from the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. Here came one of the most unusual events, and that is what would the soldiers do. By this time, 2005, the number of religious soldiers and officers, soldiers in elite units and officers coming from the religious section of Israeli society is growing. So unlike the early period where one might say this, make the same comment about kibbutz members, here it's already, we're talking about soldiers and policemen who in many cases were themselves religious Zionists. The fascinating fact of what eventually happened is that only about 130 soldiers refused to obey army orders out of something like 20,000 soldiers and policemen who I would imagine as a guess, maybe a third were religious. So we're talking about very, very small number. And in September 2005, as a result of the evacuation, and for those of you who look at the video that I mentioned earlier, you can just see it. You have to see the pictures really to get a feeling of what it really was. Those 21 settlements being torn down. Overall, what was imagined and believed by many would be a total disaster, a possible civil war over and all. The whole action was carried out in 9 days, relatively smoothly, not smoothly, but relatively smoothly, at least in terms of the expectation, and a tremendous amount of restraint by the army and police. There's a fascinating article by Eyal Levine, who analyzes what's really happening. And I won't take all of it, but just to give an idea, he did an excellent study of what we're talking about. What did the disengagement from Gaza really mean? And he gives us in this excellent paragraph in a longer article, speaking about, at that time, 22 settlements. Some said it was, because one of the settlements was actually not in Gaza itself, talking about 2,500 destroyed homes, productive farms, dozens of religious institutions, kindergartens, schools of different kind, highly developed industrial area, the Gush Katif cemetery, the Katif dairy, the second largest in the country, the Atzmona, one of the better known settlements, plant nursery, and to remember that Gush Katif reached $200 million per year and amounted for 15% of Israel's total agricultural export. And I remember going into the Gaza Strip at a later stage after my first visit in 1969 and absolutely marveling at the standard of living. The contrast was unbelievable between the very, very poor Palestinian populations and here where the settlers had built really very, very beautiful kind of areas. So what had happened? How can we really explain many of the things that I've been talking about, which surely would indicate that this must have blown up in unbelievable ways? Because there's another part of the story. And this is really to understand why, in a sense, Ariel Sharon probably felt he could carry out an act against the people who they felt he was representing. Firstly, that there were a significant part of Israeli society that regarded the Gaza Strip as a burden. If we look back at remember the very first picture, the first map, it's really the Katif area. It's really the southern Gush Katif area where you have Jewish settlements. But Israel is having to hold the Gaza Strip with something like 1.2 million Palestinians. And what was happening on a day-to-day level, because the Gush Katif is on the seaside and not on the Israeli side, getting to their homes always required a tremendous amount of military assistance. And what many Israelis were asking, perhaps not really looking at their own political or ideological perspectives, it was clear that 5,000 soldiers were required to protect about 8,000 settlers. I mean, so you can imagine even soldiers themselves, even if they identified with the Gush Katif people, they said this is a crazy thing, that we called up for reserves in many cases, as I was called up on one occasion, to protect these people. What does this really mean? The area of Gaza was very, very dangerous. A lot of conflict going on. And then came yet another surprise. We spoke about the religious settlers discussing, in some cases, their leaders speaking about disobeying army orders. But there was another response, which was very surprising, and that was 27 reserve and active pilots wrote a letter to the government rejecting Israel's policy in Gaza and the West Bank, which included targeted killings with civilian casualties. Here on both sides of the political spectrum, very respectful groups. I'm very impressed with many of the components of religious Zionists, very committed nationalistic people. And on the other hand, you have an elite group of pilots, both from both sides, bringing up an issue which was quite shocking. In addition to which, reservists of the Sayeret Matkal, which is the top of the 5 most impressive commando units, they say we shall no longer lend a hand in the occupation of the territories. So you're getting 2 totally different voices, and this shows the power of the events that we're talking about. In both cases, both these groups are totally committed to not obeying army orders. However, by September, and after masses of discussions had gone through, and the pictures that appeared on TV day in and day out, very remarkable support, by the way, of the Israeli media, on all the realms of the media, explaining how the settlers were feeling. We heard the voice very, very clearly. But by September 2005, a bit before the end of the whole program, we find that 57% supported disengagement, 43% were against or unsure, but 36% were still feared bloodshed. Some very general comments of what really happened. Firstly, I think, as I've just mentioned, the area of Gaza just felt somehow out of Israel. Very few Israelis had actually been there over the years. If you haven't been there for the army, it's unlikely that you would actually have wanted to go down to that area. What was also very important, and I think maybe one of the reasons why the amount of religious soldiers who refused to obey army orders, something in the region of 130, was the army showed a tremendous sympathy to religious soldiers. And they said, we understand how difficult it was. By the way, in some cases, they didn't take units which had a very high number of religious people in, so as not to cause them to face any unbelievably difficult situation. And it seems to be that one of the main reasons why the religious soldiers, who clearly identified in the majority of cases with these Gaza settlers, was that they realized that the Israeli army had gone a long way to deal with the needs of religious men and women in the army framework. And I think they felt very much that they were going to lose their somewhat unique status, which they had achieved until that stage. Here we see some of the pictures. Ari's introduction, Ari's picture initially shows this very famous picture. Here a policeman, here a soldier, he's a lieutenant carrying a young child, probably eating an apple or something or playing with a toy. And this appeared, the press gave absolutely every perspective they could. The yellow star, a soldier crying, clearly. As Ari mentioned initially, carrying children, conflicts between a religious man, remember one day after Tisha B'Av in particular, straight up against a young woman who's part of the military police. Women soldiers taking out a woman, moving the menorah, and there were a lot of scenes about in the synagogue world, very, very powerful scenes in the synagogue. Here we see masses of these, many of them in their orange shirts, religious people against the disengagement, standing face to face, a few inches away. I mean, you can imagine how it was. The language which was used here was very, very tough. As you'll see from the documentary, the term Nazi to the soldiers comes up again and again. I mean, just imagine being an Israeli soldier, religious or not, who's standing there called a Nazi. I mean, this is just unbelievable. What was the effect? Well, everyone was aware. There was no way that one could be an Israeli without being fully aware of it. The orange ribbons, clothes, brags, and flags, the pictures of protesters being putting on the bus, this very, very powerful picture of a soldier and a woman from Gaza hugging each other. And then the pushing down, and this was a government decision, breaking down the buildings, although many of the agricultural components were not destroyed. By the way, when the Palestinians came in, they destroyed the agricultural infrastructure. Comment by soldier. When we broke into the Neve Dekalim synagogue to evacuate the men who were fortified within, we found them singing their redemption songs, crying and dancing with the Torah scrolls. It was an astonishing sight. I remember that I was almost paralyzed when I saw their authentic pain. Then my officer, who probably felt comfortable enough, joined them and they accepted him. Afterwards, most of us joined them as well. We hugged them, danced with them, and cried with them. At those moments, I felt we had no barriers and I could empathize with their horrible situation. We don't know who the soldier is, but it sounds to me that he wasn't religious. He was almost surprised at his officer. But this really was what it was. This was the event which tore Israel apart. In the final analysis, it was apparently a majority decision, not only within the Knesset, but within the country. What happened afterwards? After September 2005, chaos. There was a government body that was set up, which was supposed to arrange accommodation for the 8,000 to 9,000 settlers. Many of them refused to cooperate. So come September 2005, they put on buses, they moved out of Gaza, and there'd been no plans for them. And that brought about a tremendous amount of tension, with many people saying afterwards, even those who were sympathetic to them, look, you had to believe that the government orders would be carried out. At least you should have made plan B, consider the possibility that you'll be moved out, and therefore there would be some sort of decision in terms of compensation for your home and somewhere else being found. Immediately there was crisis, by the way, because it was unilateral disengagement, the Palestinians of Gaza felt no commitment to doing anything for Israel. They said, you didn't speak to us. You didn't even consult with us. You know, that's pretty insulting. And therefore, the settlers find themselves in a difficult position. To conclude, Ariel Sharon eventually left the scene. Hamas took over, which made Gaza even a more difficult situation. We see that Egypt and Israel took over the role of guarding the country. Rafah area over here, this is the next to Egypt. This is where Egypt frequently closes the border. By the way, Israel is always blamed for controlling Gaza, but it's not well known, or it's conveniently forgotten, that Egypt actually controls the southern border, and then there are another 2 or 3 crossing sites which Israel controls. 2008, 3 years after the disengagement, only 5% had permanent housing, which goes into what I was saying earlier. No plan, the settlers, and I say this unfortunately, and it's true, the settlers could have improved their position if they had actually believed that this would happen, that the disengagement wouldn't happen. 20% were unemployed. Comes 2014, the unemployment rate has gone down to 12%. 88% were settled in 22 towns, 11 of them new. The crisis with Gaza continues. And this is one of the big debates in Israeli society until today. May 2021, over 4,000 rockets fired at Israel. Was it a good idea? Could Israel have taken over better control of Gaza? Would it have been a good idea to send thousands and thousands of settlers into the area? Vast numbers of opinions exist. And I mentioned this topic because although we are speaking about Gaza, in the minds of many of the people who live in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, for them, the issue of Gaza was also very much, would this happen to them? In terms of this idea of the two-state solution, which so many people speak about, could this happen to part of the Judea and Samaria, the West Bank area, or no? And so therefore, while our concentration has been in Gaza, in a certain sense, it leads us to the other issues of what could happen to the more or less 400,000 Jews living over the green line at the moment. Thanks very much, and over to you.
Thank you. Does not seem like this, in what they say, hindsight is 20/20. This does not seem like it worked out very well for Israel in many respects, but we can get there in a second. So here's some opening questions. Why, of all the days of the year, would Ariel Sharon and his team choose to do this on Tisha B'Av, or I just don't even, I don't even understand that.
You see, what happened initially, there was a lot of stuff going on. We must know that the period was very, very busy and confusing. And they had initially taken the English date, which is, they hadn't, for some reason or other, which is very strange, they hadn't actually paid attention that this was Tisha B'Av. When they did realize that at that time, there'd been so many arrangements already being made that the only thing they could actually do is delay it by 1 day. So the actual activity was not on Tisha B'Av itself, but 1 day later. But however, and the important point is that for the settlers, they were often using Tisha B'Av language. This is, I think, the power of the event. For the soldiers, they were carrying out an order. For the settlers themselves, this was in the tremendous tension of the historical significance of Tisha B'Av itself.
You know, in America, when they like start universities on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we just say, well, what do they know? But in Israel, I would assume someone would do the Jewish calendar.
Some things were going crazy. I think part of the problem, by the way, in looking back, was that Sharon had really not carried out the whole activity with anything more than a few advisors. And that isn't good sense. You know, I mean, you have to bring in very many sections of a country when you're going to do something as dramatic as this. He was an arrogant person, actually, and didn't listen to other people. So I think that might be part of the reason.
Another question has come up. Why the color orange?
I think it was the color that came initially from the revolts in Ukraine. The orange color had become at that time, a little before 2005, the color of protest in several countries of the world. And as I say, I think the initial one was in Ukraine.
Scott asks, we did a program on Americans and how they disproportionately have impacted the settler movement. When it comes to this particular, the protest, the leaders of the protest, were Americans disproportionately involved or leaders in the protest against disengagement?
No, there were a chunk of Americans. We must remember that in some ways, the most dramatic protesters were non-residents, 5,000 non-residents. But the number of Americans in Gaza was relatively small. I don't know if there's a known actual number, but it's nothing like what we see in certain of the cities of Judea and Samaria. So it's a very different kind of situation from that. By the way, there had been Americans in Yamit, which was cut down, destroyed in 1982. There had been a chunk of Americans over there. But maybe as a result of that, I'm not sure, I'm just suggesting, maybe as a result of that, not too many Americans then went into Gaza, having already seen or imagined what could happen to the area bordering Egypt.
Rochelle asks, why was the policy of the Israeli government to destroy houses and synagogues when they left? Why didn't they just leave the buildings and structures in place?
The feeling was that you didn't want, you see, there had been no agreement with the Palestinians. And I think the government, remember, it's a lot of right-wing members in the government saying, are we not only handing over our land, but are we handing over our buildings? And I think that was overwhelming. There were a lot of questions, by the way, but there was the precedent of 1982 Yamit, where they did exactly the same. So there'd already been a precedent that even if you're going to give back land, make sure that the Palestinians don't gain from it. By the way, as I mentioned briefly, there were some wonderful, wonderful hothouses which existed. And as soon as the Israelis left, they went in and destroyed the hothouses. I mean, that was crazy. So, it was kind of one of those situations, not a great deal of respect for the other side.
Did the Israeli government send in religious soldiers to on purpose, or did they refrain from sending religious soldiers?
No, they didn't on purpose. In fact, in a few cases when there were units which had an exceptionally high number of religious people, were not sent in. But if you belong to a particular unit, whatever the unit was called, it didn't really matter, and there happened to be a certain number of religious soldiers, they were expected to go in. That means that they were part of a unit, and they were expected to carry out the demand of the unit. As we saw, there were only 130 people in that category who refused to obey orders. By the way, I just want to broaden the question, because I think it's a very important question. This is not unknown in Israeli society. If we go back to my topic last week of the 1982 Lebanon War, I remember I was in a reserve unit, and just before we were sent into Lebanon, there was actually an amazing discussion. We were reserve soldiers, we weren't in the regular army, but amazing discussion where the officer came to us and said, are any of you totally against going into Lebanon? And we were quite a small unit. We were at that time a communications unit. So there was one guy on a political level refused to go into Lebanon. So our particular unit worked out an idea, which was, I think, very sensible. Rather than forcing him and then sending him to jail or something like that, they allowed him to be the supply person for our unit on the Israeli side of the border. And therefore, the supplies that we were getting all the time were sent in by him. so as not to put him in an awkward position. So the reason I'm mentioning this, there are certain cases in Israel where you kind of move the regulations just a little bit to ensure that you don't bring about too many conflicts. In other situations, you can't do anything about it. But that's exactly what happened here. There were a few excellent articles, by the way, which showed how carefully the army tried to explain to soldiers and officers who were religious why it was necessary to carry out military orders.
Of all the protests that you've talked about and researched, which is the biggest protest in the history of Israel?
There are two which are sort of high on the level of mass protest. One is certainly this one. You know, you put the figures together, 130,000 in that line, 250 Rabin Square, 20,000 right in the front there, lines there. That's a big one. The other big one, by the way, if you take the whole history of Israel, are the Haredim, because the amount of Haredi demonstrations over the years have been tremendous. And I think if you counted the numbers of the Haredim in various demonstrations from 1948, there would be more Haredim who had been involved in protest movements than this particular one. I imagine the Gaza 2005 was the second largest.
Heidi wants to know, what's the consequences of someone who disobeys an order in the military?
There are 2 or 3 mechanisms which the army use. And because Israel, to use a quote, comment that I often say in my lectures, in Israel, in Israel, a law is something that you might want to accept if you're in the mood. That is Israeli society. It is genuinely a non-legalistic society. You cannot believe how non-legalistic it's when I compare it with America, we're talking about 2 countries on different planets. So what happens in the army, because of that, the army tries where possible, but not in all units. See, the army is such a big bureaucracy, a massive bureaucracy. Different units will deal with disobeying orders in different kind of ways. Sometimes it's persuading. I've seen it myself. You know, you can get out of the army fairly easily by going to a psychologist or someone like that. The army doesn't want that to happen. So rather than forcing people into a situation where they would be sent to jail, there'd be a court case and they're sent to a military jail, in many, many cases, often under the table, there are mechanisms or there are attempts to try and ensure that it won't reach that kind of level. So, by the way, obvious conscientious objectors are another category. But in these particular, one-time event, Lebanon war or Gaza or something like that, the army tries to ensure that that person doesn't become sort of an outsider to society, but rather working around the regulations. And that's what I can say. I mean, military people would probably disagree with me. What I'm saying is I've actually seen quite often on the ground.
Debbie Meline asked you to see a different future if Sharon had survived and seen the violence that occurred after the disengagement. Would he have sent Israel back in to Gaza? I don't know if you can answer that question, but
it's a kind of one of those ifs of history. It's a history very tough. No, I don't think he would have sent soldiers back in, because he had. It's been such a dramatic and traumatic event in history. I couldn't imagine many political leaders ever wanting to do it again, to go back into, and to remember that the number of Palestinians grew. It was a rapidly growing society. It was no longer a moderate Palestinian group, but moved from the Palestinian Authority, the Fatah, to the Hamas. So it became even more nationalistic. So I think it's not only about Sharon, but I doubt whether any leader would really ever want to go back. We know we've been at war with the Hamas on a number of occasions. And the question is, how do we get out as quickly as possible? And I think that is essentially the answer. If we have to go in, get out. And once again, anyone who doesn't understand that if you had the possibility of going to see what Gaza is about, you kind of realize why it's a good idea to get out of very quickly.
So final question for the final lecture, and on this particular session. Did we ever get an answer as to the decision-making process in Sharon's mind and why he, out of anyone, is the one that did this?
You know, the literature suggests a number of possibilities. One is the fact that the figure of 5,000 soldiers required to protect 8,000 settlers didn't make sense to him as a military person. The second, that I think he genuinely believed that Israel didn't gain much by holding that territory. It's not a regular territory. It's territory filled with refugees, filled with pitiful populations. And I've got a feeling that he kind of hoped that this would be the mechanism of somehow bringing Israel closer to a more relaxed situation in the Middle East. But once again, this is surmising, and we don't, from all the stuff that I've read, I've never really found any information which would satisfy me 100%. And I think it's really a gambit of kind of things. By the way, I would add one final comment. There's in history, there's a whole theory that as people get older, they think more than anything about what their legacy is. And, some people say that about Menachem Begin, the famous right-wing leader who signed an agreement with Anwar Sadat of Egypt. Egypt was our greatest enemy, and then left Yamit, the beautiful city of Yamit. Was it because Begin had actually changed his political view, or was it in his case because he was getting ill that he was very concerned about his legacy and he wanted his legacy to be a legacy of peace and not war? Was that true with Sharon or not? No one really knows.
Thank you. Well, thank you for taking us through 4 really interesting, challenging civil protests in the history of the young country of Israel. I'm sure there'll be more. Is there a protest that we didn't, what would be that if we had done one more session in the series, what would you have covered as a
I think the Haredi protests are fascinating because they cover everything under the sun. I mean, that's the kind of the widest one, from autopsies to archaeology digs to army service. So that's always an interesting one. Also, the protests of the Arab population, by the way. There have been some big protests, and recently, May this year, we saw the conflicts in the mixed cities in Israel. So that's a high level of protest as well. There have been the cottage cheese protest, women's protests, by the way, very, very effective. You can take the whole women's issue, see how, particularly from the left of center perspectives, they've been very active as well. I think one thing about living in Israel, there's always some sort of protest. It's just a matter of choosing which one seems to be the most important.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for the series. And, Paul Liptz is one of our CSP scholars, so he'll be back. We'll work on some new programs. I think we're going to do a program focused on the Arab communities who live in Israel, so we can look at the Bedouin a little more deeply, as well as other Palestinian communities who live in Israel. And I'm sure Paul will come up with some more, because this is now his hobby and he enjoys it, and we enjoy having him. So to all of you out there, thank you for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. Keep well.
Bye-bye.
Shalom, shalom.
Take care. Bye, everybody. Peace out.